When dealing with a falsehood, you're faced with two options. You can accept it or you can reject it. The basis upon which we take one of these actions is a product of our critical thinking capabilities and a desire to know what is true instead of confirming our bias. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. On Brainstorm, we choose the hard truths over the comforting lies. Reason, compassion, skepticism. This is the Brainstorm Podcast.
Hey folks, I'm not going to do too much of a preamble with this one. A little while back, the American Psychological Association came out with a set of guidelines for treating men and boys when they seek therapy or if they're required to get it for some reason. Not long after that, Gillette came out with an ad that addressed the topic of toxic masculinity. I suppose it's obvious that there are some people who disagreed with the APA and flipped out at the Gillette ad. But I obviously did not. Aaron Rabi and I talk about those criticisms and a bit about toxic masculinity in general. I'm going to add links to the show notes for the APA guidelines and the article that came out with it, as well as a link to the Gillette ad. Remember that if you want to give us any feedback on this episode or any other episode, you can do that at mail@brainstormblog.net. If you like what we do on Brainstorm, then share us around. Give us a rating on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Podknife, or Podchaser, or you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/brainstormpodcast. Other than that, I'm going to send you over to this chat with Aaron Rabi after this promo for another podcast.
Hi, this is Dan,
Ryan, and Matt with the Godless Revolution podcast. We've had a lot of great guests on this show,
such as Russell Glasser, Dan Arrow, Brian Fields, David Silverman, Doug Mesner, a.k.a. Lucian Greaves, and Joey Kirkman, whom we love a lot.
We've also had a lot of really cool local guests. And we're a podcast that likes to fight for the separation of church and state and against anti-skepticism of all kinds.
You should give us a listen, because if you don't, you're going to be really sad.
Make your ears happy. Listen to the Godless Revolution podcast.
All right, so welcome to the Brainstorm Podcast Skeptic Studio. Today I'm talking to everybody's go-to philosopher SJW, Aaron Rabi. Thanks for joining me.
How you doing, man?
Not too bad.
It's good to be back. It's been a while since our marathon.
Yeah, that's right. Should do it more often, I guess.
Happy to.
Yes, if we can ever get our schedules figured out all the time.
Right.
Busy people leading busy lives.
So little to do, so much time to do it in.
Yeah. So I guess we're going to talk about the APA guidelines for men and boys a little bit, and then maybe a little bit about toxic masculinity and this Gillette advertisement. Mm-hmm. So to start off, I mean, I read probably about a third of the guidelines, and I didn't see anything objectionable about it. So I guess maybe we should introduce what they are.
Sure. So the APA, or the American Psychological Association, put out guidelines, just like they did a while ago, for how to treat women and issues relating specifically to concerns with women. I think that may have been like even 10 years ago at this point. This they just put out is a new document. Essentially, they're not enforced. These are sort of useful in their minds, useful guidelines, suggestions for people, for therapists who are treating men and boys, and how to better recognize and assess various challenges that they may be facing in the current world, given a lot of changing cultural norms and expectations. And so it's a set of guidelines. They're pretty, I mean, they kind of read like stereo instructions, let's be honest. Like it is kind of a dry text of sort of citations of a bunch of different things that, you know, we can break down some specifics if you want, but it's mostly just an attempt to try to update people's understanding of what is making men have worse outcomes in a variety of ways.
So kind of like almost anything, like if you're going to treat people with these problems, this is maybe some guidelines as to how you would do it.
Yep, it's pretty much just that.
Doesn't yeah, okay. So
yeah, and I mean, like, we'll talk about the criticisms, but I do think that, like, there's a lot of different layers of criticisms, and one of them may just be that from the outset, it's the idea that some people take issue with that there's anything wrong with men, and I don't think that this is not really meant to, well, like, this is complicated, right? So what this sort of stuff gets at is the things that men are having problems with, right? If you want to put it in mean terms, things that are wrong with men, quote unquote. But I don't like that sort of... Right. I like to say it in terms of people get habituated to behaving in different ways, and men are getting habituated to behave in certain problematic ways. They are not by nature bad. Men are not by nature bad. Nowhere in any of this does it say that. But they are getting consistently habituated, or have traditionally been consistently habituated into certain often harmful, both to themselves and to others, kinds of behaviors. And the more that we can bring their attention to those things that they were habituated into, the more they can consciously work their way out of them. So, like, yeah, in the broad spectrum, it's not an attack, right? This has been portrayed by a lot of very bad faith actors, in my opinion, as an attack on all of masculinity or all of men or anything like that. And they definitely put in a bit of work, I think, in trying to counteract that view. I think that they could have done more. Like, I do think there is a little bit to be said that they could have better anticipated some of the response that they were going to get. But I do think that they went to some effort to do that. So... Right,
they didn't go in completely blind to the fact that men are, in a very real sense, not supposed to acknowledge problems that they face.
Right. No, I do think that they were, and I guess it's hard because the guidelines themselves are written for people in the field. So it's not necessarily a text that's meant to convert non-believers.
Right.
So some of the criticism I saw a lot was, well, why didn't they present all of the teach the controversy kind of, you know, gender is real and essential kind of stuff that they don't include in this very much at all.
Right.
And I think, while I do understand that people want more of that, I don't think that every paper that addresses issues like this has to be prefaced with that kind of teaching the controversy. And I don't think that the goal here was to convince people of this particular perspective so much as to show how this perspective can be used to help people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. I guess, trying to wrap my head around this idea, like, the teaching the controversy, or like presenting the controversy, to me, like, it was presented very plainly, like, this is what the evidence shows. We accept these statistical truths about men in general, and based on this definition of men or masculinity. And I mean, it was very much like social science saying, hey, systemic racism is a thing. This is like, hey, this is a thing, and this is how you deal with it.
Yeah, and so they took stuff like that, and I mean, so again, I'm trying to, like, tease apart the different kinds of criticisms of this. Another one of them that I think I didn't see this. Well, no, I saw this presented in the form of, this is based on biased or ideological research. But, like, one thing that they do in this guideline when they go through their definitions is they present definitions that are effectively controversial, I guess I would say, in the sense that they take for granted views about the difference between gender and sex that these folks would disagree with. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, like, so where does that leave people who disagree with that? Like, I mean, to me, once the like a major organization of psychiatrists or psychologists says, hey, gender is this thing and sex is that other thing, don't we just have to like accept that these are the experts in this field and this is how it is?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think we can look for ourselves and see if you can really pry apart these two things conceptually. And I do think you can. And I think what you find is one of them is biological, as we've discovered, right? Sex, there is this sort of biological difference between certain individuals. And I don't think that we do ourselves any favors if we try to deny that part of it. Right. But that there's this other separate thing, which we now basically call gender, which is the way that the individual presents themselves and engages with other people in culture. One of the factors that drives gender is, I think, biological sex sometimes, right? Like different sexes are expected to act differently because of certain features that people think they have, whether they have them or they don't. But what we find is that like the gender side of things really does seem constructed, right? The more you ask, what are the essential features of a specific gender, the more you don't find anything. And you realize that like this is just a construct that we've made up that may have some functionality for some individuals. It may be valuable for people living a rich life. Like if it really matters to you to present as masculine, maybe that's a part of a life of flourishing for you, but it's not like you have to do these particular things if you're XY chromosome, you have to do these particular things if you're YY, you know, like it doesn't transfer that kind of way. And I think there's enough evidence that I think even non-experts in the field can reasonably see the value of distinguishing between these concepts.
Yeah, I mean, even as far back as, say, 10 years ago or so, I was at a point once where I was like, because I relate all this stuff back to my personal life, the way I think most people do. I was asking the question, well, what does it mean to be a man? Like, what does that even mean?
Right.
And then people throw out all these things, and you got to say, like, at some point, like, well, how do you decide that? Where did that come from? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I always drill down on this because as a philosopher, it matters a lot to me if we, like if these concepts are fuzzy and ill-defined and yet people take them very seriously, you get harms. You get people sort of feeling a kind of constant existential anxiety because they're not achieving this thing that they can't achieve because it is real, right? So like, take like the way people talk about the gendered virtues, as I call them sometimes, like men are naturally more aggressive and women are naturally more empathetic or something like that, right? Like, I think that, I think that it's really problematic because we haven't done a good job teasing apart all the different causes that go into someone's character. But even at a conceptual level, there's nothing about empathy that makes it fundamentally feminine versus masculine, right? There's no reason, maybe even if we took for granted the idea that it were true that there is some biological difference between the male sex and the female sex when it comes to desires to empathize, even though I don't really actually believe that. Right. Even if that were true, that could just be a artifact of our evolutionary track, right? That split the genders, split the sexes in these particular ways, because it was adaptive at some point to do so. There's nothing that says that in a modern developed world that we currently live in, that we need to continue to maintain and reinforce any sex difference that there was, right? Unless you can show that sex difference is still importantly valuable in some kind of way, and I don't really think that you can, right? It makes sense to say, let's not code people anymore. You're a feeler and you're a thinker and stuff like that, and let people blend together like a little bit more when it comes to the sexes. And what I think you'll find is, right, culture and biology interact all the time. They've been doing so for like 40,000 years, right? Your physical body is different because of food preparation and things like it. This goes really far back. I think maybe we've talked about this before, but like, culture easily shifts biology, I think. Biology leads into and sets some basic frameworks for culture, but culture in turn can definitely reshape biology, and it should for the better, ethically speaking, right? We are now beings that can think about morality in a way that our biological ancestors couldn't, and our ability to do so, this is all going a little far afield, but like our ability to do so should drive us to question any system that we're a part of and figure out if it really is essential or if the harms that are coming from it aren't being counterbalanced in some kind of way. And so I guess to bring this all the way back around, like I think there is evidence for and good reason for splitting these things up and treating them as different things. So the criticisms that are like, this is, ideologically biased, I think don't hold any water here. Right. Those along with the ones that just mischaracterize this as an attack on men are the two that I think sort of fail the most to engage with any actual legitimate pushback on these guidelines.
I wonder, like, is this kind of essentialist thinking about gender and sex and how people who think that they can't be separated, is this kind of like an appeal, like an appeal to nature kind of mistake in thinking?
Well, it depends, because you have to find out first if they mean it in a descriptive way or a prescriptive way. Right. Yeah, so half of them think biology really can't be changed that much. And so if you try to do it, you just cause harm. So that's sort of the descriptive model. Whereas the prescriptive would say you ought not to change the nature of men or masculinity in this kind of way. Right. So for the descriptivists, I think they're just empirically wrong, right? I just think that like the biology can change and has changed in a variety of ways. The domestication of men is sort of part of the history of human culture, what they call the feminizing of men. But I think, again, that implies that there is some essential gendered nature to the virtue of getting along well in a non-violent society, which just seems like nonsense to me. But then the
I was thinking about that this morning, actually.
Oh yeah,
like because when I went to the gym this morning, and people are using various equipment, and often you'll get like people using equipment that other people were already using because they walked away to get water or whatever, and I have in the past been confronted by people, and my instinct is always to be like, "Oh, geez, sorry, I didn't mean to use your equipment or what you were using." And often when you do that, when you're apologetic and nice, people like men look at you as though you are not as masculine as them, as though being nice is a feminine quality.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there is an attachment, there's a connection between sort of what these guys think of as the traditional man that is under fire here and the kind of honor culture vision of a male. That like a man is, there's a reason that men are more quick to aggression, right? In theory, right? It would be because this is my imagining how they would put it, right? Like, could do the Peterson voice if you want, but that's fine. Like there's a reason that men are more quick to aggression. If you live in an honor culture, right, and you don't respond aggressively when someone challenges you, that can go very poorly for you and those you are meant to protect, right? So there's some value within that culture to that. I guess it just seems like we've replaced, or we are working as a world to replace honor cultures with like rule of law and civil society in a sense. And there's this weird conflict with these folks where like they do love sort of modern civilized society, but they also seem to want a world where men still act like dueling is normal. Like there's this weird tension of like, what exactly do you want men to be at this point? Like, where do you think the feminizing really went too far? Was it when men stopped killing each other because of slights against their honor? Or was it like when they started letting women have equal voice? Like, and I mean, like, I don't want to strawman any of them as being,
but they do have to draw
misogynistic.
that line somewhere, right?
Right. There's got to be some explanation for where it, like, to me, what you see is two sets of virtues that were artificially kept separate by culture, right? The male sphere of virtues and the female sphere of virtues. And in the modern age, those spheres are recombining, right? The equality movements have led us to realize that, like, people can do all of these things, and a fully fledged person should do all of these things, right? Like, and that's something that they get sort of squirrely about too, because they'll hype the stoicism stuff, but they'll also be like, oh, but men were also allowed to feel emotions back then. You're sort of straw manning traditional masculinity when you say that men weren't allowed to feel these ways. And I think that's just false. That I think that like there is a long history of abuse handed down by men to other men as a way to reinforce their emotional behaviors that hasn't ended, right? Like, for some people, maybe it ended like 5 minutes ago, but for a lot of people, it's still a fact of life. Yeah. So that's the sort of stuff I think that, like, the guidelines correctly highlight as things that we need to work on.
Yeah. So I guess some of the things that it brought up was like, I mean, these are problems that men's rights activists often talk about, right? Like increased suicide rates and, heart disease and like health outcomes that are negative.
Risk of being the target of violent crime.
Right. So what is their objection to that aspect of it? Or do they actually look at that and go, oh yeah, okay, well, they're addressing things we talk about?
I think they would take issue with the explanation of why those results are happening, right? So usually the response I get is, those negative statistics are not because traditional masculinity is bad. It's because the modern world has turned against traditional masculinity and is deliberately trying to harm people who engage in traditional, it's some version of, or that, like, you know, even if it wasn't deliberate, like by accident, the modern world has feminized everyone to the point where traditional masculinity is more problematic. Though, I mean, like, I think the reality is that, like, men have always faced these problems. And, like, if you looked further back into the statistics, like, you'd probably still find that like, men were the ones who were more likely to go off and die in war. And it's something that the guidelines points to, is that men can be harmed even while being a part of the patriarchy, right? So there's a quote they reference here, though men benefit from patriarchy, they are also impinged upon by patriarchy. Because, you know, in like creepy sorts of ways. Like, if you think about things like how culture, it glorifies and, you know, makes sacred the female body, often in really problematic, creepy ways. Right. Whereas it views male bodies often as disposable. So, I mean, and again, you can go back on the other side of that and talk about, like, the way that abortion is looked at. So none of this is just hard and fast absolutes.
Right. It's like, you can't expect, like, rigid rules about some of this stuff, right?
Right. It's more about picking up on different patterns, you know, noticing reoccurring themes. So they talk in there's a good intro thing that they posted before the guidelines that I wish they'd included formally in the guidelines, because it does address a lot of the things that people complained about, and I don't know why they included it as a separate preface, but rather than as part of the guidelines. But so, for example, they comment in here about the intersectionality of certain harmful tropes with men and being black, and how you get what they call John Henry Ism. Which
I was actually I've never heard that term before. I read it in this paper. I guess I don't know. I didn't look into it that much. Like, where does that come from?
I've heard it before, I think on like Code Switch or something, where they talk about sort of the expectation of all of the expectations that get put on black men in particular create the need for this kind of perfect person who never gets angry and is sort of super perfectly reliable and nice all the time and never shows any negative emotions and is sort of a beacon of good black, how do they say? Let's see, a high effort method of coping that involves striving hard in the face of prolonged stress and discrimination. This has been linked with hypertension. So, that's the kind of intersectionality stuff that I think is useful, that it seems to me like it's valuable to talk and, to get into the fine grains of how different identities create specific kinds of problems. But you first have to assume that intersectionality is true, and some of the people who are opposing this want us to first debate the reality of intersectionality, and I think that's just it's a problem you get in philosophy too, where you can always ask why and ask for more explanation, but at some point there has to be a cutoff of, here's all this evidence that we've accrued, feel free to raise a counter argument, but this is what we have.
Yeah, that is something that I did see in this that raised a red flag for me, was not for my beliefs or whatever, but that other people would cling on to, was this idea of different identities and how, if you say that African American men experience things in a different way, then you're lumping all African American men together in this thing, and the anti-identity politics people it would be an easy target for them.
Which is ironic, because what we would say is we're talking statistical outcome probabilities. We're not talking, all people 100% of the time. Just like they like to say when they talk about, differences between the genders, they're not saying no man can be empathetic or no woman can be aggressive, just that there's a slight difference in the norm median spread of these kinds of personality traits across individuals. So, it's hard. One other concern that I did have with at least one other that I had with the guidelines, that, I do think it's hard when you have these folks making these really outlandish attacks, because it detracts from being able to have a conversation about how maybe these could have been better, right? What could have been helpful here. And one thing that occurred to me reading it is a critique that I've seen of psychology in general, which is that it tends to focus on the abnormal or the negative. And so it tends to focus primarily on disorders, for example, and doesn't spend as much time painting a clear picture of what positive mental health is like. This is something the Gestaltists are really big on, and they tried to create their own versions of positive mental health that I think would be really useful here, that we should be talking about identity flexibility, I think, right? The ability to reorient your sense of identity as you mature as an individual, so that you don't feel like, if I give up this sense of stoic indifference, that I won't be me, or the best me that I could be anymore, I guess. So I do think that what that translated into for these folks was, it felt like this was only talking about the negative sides of traditional masculinity and nothing about the positive sides. And I think if they are right, it's not because the writers didn't think that there were absolutely no positive sides. I have a specific quote to the contrary here, but it's because psychologists, I think, tend to focus on the problem. Right? And not quite enough on what not having a problem might look like.
Right. Yeah, I guess that makes sense for the field itself too, though, doesn't it? They're assessing issues and trying to find ways to treat those issues. It's medicine doesn't study healthy people that much. Right.
Though you want more of that, right? And maybe it ends up falling to the philosophers to talk about, well, what is a good life, and everyone else can work on what is a bad life.
And how to get to that good life.
Right. But there was a whole section in the intro article that wasn't in the guidelines, that I wish had just been straight in the guidelines, called Supporting the Positive, where they open with saying, it's also important to encourage pro-social aspects of masculinity, says McDermott. In certain circumstances, traits like stoicism and self-sacrifice can be absolutely crucial, he says. But the same tough demeanor that might save a soldier's life in a war zone can destroy it at home with a romantic partner or child. Right. A little more of that would have probably gone a long way here, and I know that that's maybe a small quibble, but like the more times in the guidelines where they could have said, here's how you talk about this as a positive masculine trait, could have maybe helped. Again, I'm anxious about that because I don't like virtue. I don't like gendering any of the virtues ever, right? I just think that it's wrong to talk about it like, but for some people need that, right? And so they want to see this virtue attached to this concept of gender that still matters to them, even though I don't understand it, right? And so for them, throw them a bone and say like, show them The Rock, show them, positive.
Terry Crews.
Terry Crews, exactly, right? Positive and yet uncontrovertibly masculine role models, right? Yeah, for them.
For sure. That's something that I've been trying to put out there a little bit, is that idea of, okay, well, here's some positive role models. Here's some decent men that don't fall into these awful behaviors that that many men seem to do.
Yeah. And so, I guess one other point of criticism that I've gotten from some folks is they just don't, I don't want to say they're being disingenuous, and I don't want to just assume that they have these problems but aren't aware of them. Maybe there are parts of the world or individuals who are, who young men are growing up now with not as much of the programming as I feel like I got in my life, and maybe you can say whether you got or not, but like, and so this
I probably got it more than most.
This carries over, I think, a little bit into the Gillette ad thing too, where it's like, I think they feel like this is a straw man or an overly dark view of masculine behavior because they personally, and maybe their cohort of male friends, are not in their minds acting like this or experiencing these things personally nearly as much. And so that could be another point at which there might be some legitimate disagreement in the sense that like you and this person might experience reading this material differently because they're coming from a different mindset than you are.
Right.
I think that in that situation, right, the ultimate synthesis is this is still very clearly a problem for some people. It's good if it's getting better in some places, but like merely not having experienced this yourself doesn't mean that this isn't important and like something that's a big issue in the world right now.
Something like maybe I'm not being charitable enough when I think of it, because when I've seen people arguing against these kind of toxic male behaviors and attitudes, it's often in my, how do I word this? I feel like a lot of times it's the same coding, the same training that got us to those toxic places has also kind of taught us to be blind to those things and to just accept like this way that men treat other men shitty and don't support each other is normal. That's how it's supposed to be. So
yeah, well,
rather than, where your viewpoint seems a bit more charitable, where like maybe they just experienced it in a different way and so they don't see it because of that.
Right. So one of the parts of the traditional masculine model that has made it hard to budge, as it were, is that it does, in various parts, downplay introspection. Right. It's not the role of a man to do that kind of introspecting and right. Like, I mean, and again, there are versions of that in various places. I'm not saying that there is no traditional masculine culture that in no way engage. Like, you can look at the samurai, right? Like they engage in introspection. I'm not saying this is 100%. I do think in sort of a West, especially in the modern West, there, where I can at least personally speak from experience, there is, and this is something that as psychologists they talk a lot about, is that like, you have to get through a special layer or sense of pushback from a lot of men who are resistant to the idea of even having a look inside under the hood and seeing what's going on. Right. So, and everyone has that. Like, I'm not saying that that no one else besides men have these issues, but I do think that culture can either help us be aware of and correct for things, or it can exacerbate them. And I think a lot of these things are things that American culture and Western culture has exacerbated for a while now.
Yeah. I guess it's kind of off topic, a little, or like off of the exact paper, but about a week and a half ago, I had a conversation about bullying. Mm-hmm. And the person I was talking to said like, oh, well, you know, all these anti-bullying things, we were all fine growing up and now everybody's got all these feelings. Mm-hmm. And my instinct is like, well, I mean, I got into a bit of a disagreement with him about it, obviously, but I think, like I was said, we all have always had all these feelings. It's whether or not we're aware of them and we can actually deal with them. Otherwise, we're just ignoring them, and it can create bigger problems further on down the road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's almost certainly the case that, like, this is another objection that you get, which is, either descriptively, you can't make the world safe for people, and so you shouldn't, in some sense, try beyond a certain point, or prescriptively, people get toughened up by dealing with this sort of stuff, and so you benefit from being toughened up by these kind of things. And I just think there's much better ways for people to grow and flourish and become healthy people without like having to deal with, you know, gendered forms of abuse. You know, like, you're right, you can't make the world totally safe, but there's no reason to then throw up your hands with regard to low-hanging fruit like this.
And it's all, you mentioned dueling before, and it's almost like sometimes men view the way, like the men I know view the world as though it's a gladiator arena. Mm-hmm. And what we're really doing is we're training boys to be gladiators in this arena because they're going to have to fight to survive somehow. And I don't see the world that way.
No.
I don't feel like it is a gladiator arena.
And I mean, if it is, it's not one in which a gendered conception of virtue is likely to win you anything at this point. Like, we're past that. Yeah. Unless things go really far backwards very quickly. Like, we're past the point at which you're likely to garner a substantial advantage from leaning into this kind of stuff rather than developing a more balanced personality. So, one other criticism I should throw in here just for the sake of not getting added later, is that some folks have pointed out, and I can't confirm nor deny any of this because I am not a clinical psychologist and I don't know the research well enough, that not just that these fields are all intellectually bankrupt, but more specifically that the surveys that were cited here have various problems, and that some of this was individuals surveying their own work or something like that. So, I mean, I'd be curious to hear follow-up from psychologist folks about that. I think that generally speaking, the guidelines are the guidelines are not extreme, right? They're very bland. Like, they're not making extreme claims. They're things like, hey, be aware of, you know, how these people might be at a higher risk because of various kinds of things. Here's some kinds of advocacy that might help a little better, like approach them, you know, this way so that you don't, set off their sort of defensive responses, right? Very basic, boring stuff. So, like, I don't think that it needs any more than it had in terms of the research that was presented. I think unless you really do reject the philosophy wholesale, like, it's not that controversial a document.
It seems, I don't know, it seems really dishonest to, like, try and go in and, I mean, an organization like the APA could make mistakes in setting out these guidelines, and I'm sure there was multiple people involved in this. Like, it wasn't just one dude who made up this stuff based on the surveys he managed to read that day. Like, this was tons of work went into this, and for people to come on and say, oh, well, that survey's got this flaw that I don't like, and it seems very cherry picky to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you could always have included more teaching the controversy, I suppose. But, like, it's feels very like it feels like it's hard to really lay out the time for some of the kinds of stuff that people would want to like nitpick over. So I mean, like, and it's funny. I feel sort of similarly with the Gillette ad, where it's like, you know, I think that they went really far out of their way to like convey the message properly, and so I feel like the responses are, you know, I don't want to get in any trouble. Like, it's ironic that people are getting this emotionally worked up about this stuff. Like, I really do, like, for people who spend a lot of time criticizing others for getting overly worked up about stuff, I just feel like there's a lot of irony.
Yeah, like I said before we started recording, you're much more nicer than I am in these instances. Like, I look at the guys that are flipping out over this Gillette ad, and I just go, "What? Like, you're so fragile. You're made of glass, but you don't want to admit it. Like we're all made of glass. Some people can admit it."
And the Gillette ad is just, it feels like so much more of a no-brainer to me, where it's like, you can't say it's against all men because men are the ones fixing the situation every single time, right? Like, if it had been like a woman stopping a man in every single frame to be like, "Hey, dude, stop doing that," like, then maybe I could understand some like complaint about this. But like, the whole point was men habituate men to act in certain ways, and we can habituate ourselves to be better, and we're doing it, and we're just going to keep doing it, and that's great. And like, I don't know how that felt like a huge attack to some people. I mean, I guess, you know, I really do have a hard time understanding how you could listen to that or watch that ad and think that the point was to use lazy stereotypes to bash men. Like, it was clearly meant to criticize the stereotypes that men have to suffer under.
Yeah, that's right. It's and to point out that we don't have to fit into those stereotypes.
Right.
Like,
it's an inversion of the tropes. And you can get into a debate. I love these debates about, like, do inversions of the tropes in turn, you know, influence those tropes, or do they promote, like, is it a problem where you give a platform to that trope, and so that trope spreads even though you are specifically calling it out? But I think we can't make any progress until we address the problem, and if the complaint is merely even addressing the problem causes more of the problem, then then what do we do?
It's a good question. Yeah, it does strike me as similar to the idea of satire. Right. Often, like, I
didn't want to say it because all the philosophers in space people, they're going to come for me now.
I suppose. Yeah. But like Stephen Colbert, right? Like, a lot of people wonder if he really had a positive or a negative impact based on, like, he had a lot of conservative supporters, right?
Well,
or fans.
He had I don't know, a lot. He had some conservatives who seemed to like him. And not think that it was making fun of them.
Yeah, that's right. And not think that it was like making fun of them. So in a way, it's similar. Like, often does the media we put out, what impact does it actually have?
Yeah, the example that comes to mind for me was I think it was when Seth MacFarlane hosted the Oscars. Is that, I think that's right. And he did an opening shtick about sexism in Hollywood.
Okay.
But it kind of felt just like a bunch of boob jokes. And it felt like you weren't doing the work to invert the tropes properly. So, I mean, I think this is all about, you can't just say the mere presence of a trope, right? Or the mere reference of a trope, as we would say, is proof of, or cause of harm. It's the way that whether the trope gets effectively inverted or not, I think, is the important part, and whether the person puts in the work to show the trope in the right context. And I feel like Gillette did a pretty good job with that for the most part. So
I thought,
you know,
but I guess I'm the kind of guy that they're targeting with that as an ad, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's be clear. They were targeting probably, I mean, I don't know if this contradicts my other argument, but I do think one of my friends who's works in capitalist hell, helping people with advertising, just was laughing and laughing about the Gillette thing. And she's just like, Gillette just won a Super Bowl worth of advertising for free.
That's right.
So like every person who attacked the ad probably helped them as much as the people who were supporting the ad. And also basically that like, it's likely that Gillette made some sort of mathematical calculation at some point that they would garner more interest within purchasers who have higher incomes than they would lose amongst purchasers who tend to have lower incomes. So like there's a purely mathematical capitalism doesn't care about you side to this.
Right, yeah.
But I also think the artists themselves were really trying to make a valuable point and did a pretty good job doing so. Like I think that if they had wanted to make rage bait, they could have made more effective rage bait. Like I felt like this was tame, and that's why it was more effective that people overreacted to it.
Right.
I guess would be the way I would say it. But it does point to, and that plus the APA stuff and Peterson's rise to popularity and everything points to a common concern that I do have about what men are facing today and how they are dealing with it. That like there is a big existential crisis for men in the modern world, and there's also a lot of animosity towards men, some of it earned, right, some of it inherited, right? And so those people experiencing that existential crisis are often walking headfirst into a lot of anger, some of it justified, but probably not necessarily towards that particular male person, right? And so they get radicalized pretty effectively, and that is a concern that I have. And I think it's something that, I always come back to like, we just got to double down more on doing the right thing. And it's just like, you've got to be nicer. You've got to,
but it's so hard.
You've got to help them along more, like for your sake and theirs. And I don't mean this condescendingly. I mean this lovingly. Like, I've had people who've confronted me on things that I sucked at when it came to these particular issues. I've had to come around to recognizing how pervasive the problem is in a variety of mediums. And it's hard. And like, we have to be sympathetic to people on that journey, even if it feels like we're always encountering another person right at the beginning of that journey every single day.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of been the thing with atheism and skepticism and trying to promote critical thinking and trying to like you're always in a constant like an anti-racism and anti-sexism. You're always starting over. It never feels like you actually make any progress. Even if you do make progress with that one person or present an argument that convinces one person, then you might never talk to that person again.
Yeah. I guess as an educator, I'm sort of used to the Sisyphean nature of education, that it's always, you're always back to the next rock and the next hill. I mean, I do think that one other thing I want to reiterate here while I'm, proselytizing for people to double down on being nice and dealing with this is, I do think what's good about the Gillette is that it emphasizes that it should be the role of men to help other men with this. That like, it is not the role of women to have to go to excessive lengths to educate individuals on this. That like, it works better if it comes from other men, I think. And it's because we have not been the ones, for the most part, suffering under this stuff all of this time, right? We have more psychological resources in a sense, right? Like, it doesn't surprise me that the women on Twitter who get harassed 20 times a day respond to totally new people with like, 1 second worth of patience. Like, I get that, like,
for sure.
And I have a hard time calling them out, even though I do want them to like do the same thing that I'm suggesting that we should do. To me, it's a supererogatory action for everybody else except men, I guess is what I would say, right? And for men, it's obligatory. Everyone else can do it, and that's great, and we appreciate it. But like, for us, it should be our job.
Right. Yeah. Similar to, like, it's not up to people of color to convince white people that that racism is bad or that systemic racism exists. It's up to the rest of us.
Yeah.
It's up to us white folks.
It's hard too. Like I've been in rooms where sexism is happening and it's hard to speak up. It's so much easier to just go along to get along. Like I see it all the time. I've done it myself. I'm ashamed to say it. Like it is difficult to fight the social conditioning and say, I'm not okay with this, especially when there's almost always no benefit to you personally, right? You're not going to make any friends and you're most likely going to make enemies, right?
Yeah, that's
so it sucks, right? There's not a good payoff and that's unfortunate. And it's why, again, I double down on the sympathy, right? I'm sympathetic to everyone, to the people who need help and the people who are helping. And it's all bad.
It's all bad.
It's all bad.
Yeah. I guess I'm used to being around men who express sexism or toxic behaviors a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. It's just sometimes I mean, I don't want to present myself as any kind of like victim or whatever, but it does seem sometimes like you're every day, even with the same person, you're saying the same things.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. No, I mean, like, I don't know if it's a fixable problem. I know that we're obligated to continue to work on it.
We have to keep trying. Yeah.
But I don't have any, silver bullets or anything. I'm not holding out on anybody here. All I do know is that, man. Like,
give me the answer.
No, I mean, the answer is we need to stop with the people who are just poisoning the well by suggesting that, like, the people making these ads or the people making the APA guidelines hate men and, like, want to see men, shackled under the yoke of femininity or some nonsense. Like, because that doesn't help at all.
Obviously false, right?
Right. No, and it doesn't allow for any room for the men who are struggling to legitimately struggle. I really feel like when you look at a lot of the stuff that gets put before men in these men's rights groups and from Peterson and stuff, that it tells them that they should stop struggling with their problems to begin with, in the sense that, like, they should externalize the locus of the problems, the causes of it, and, like, that if there are internal problems, it is the struggle itself that is the internal problem that has to kind of be put down, right? That like feminism poisons men by planting that seed of doubt in them, and it has to be removed before the man can really be the full masculine self that he needs to be.
Right. Yeah.
So, I mean, there is that kind of sort of cult style method of sort of squashing the very impetus to have these internal doubts about this whole thing, that it's a big problem. And so there's so many downstream problems from it, because, like, identity is really important, right? I've talked a lot about it being constructed, but that doesn't make it not important. Like, people's identities are incredibly important to them, and if you start down a problematic track, it's very, very, very hard to work yourself back. Some would say impossible. Folks like Aristotle were like, if you don't get the starting positions at the beginning of life, you're probably screwed. So
I don't think that's right.
No, I don't go that far. But it is very hard, like, because so much of our sense of self can get very defensive, and so that's why I think you see so much defensive response to all of this stuff. Seeing it as an attack is because for a lot of these guys, it feels like, it is an attack on their very nature. And for the other ones, they feel like, I think, that they're being pushed into a world that criminalizes their nature. So, I mean, I've had some folks who, like, link the Gillette stuff to, feeling like they don't even know how to, like, they slide from stuff like, well, catcalling is bad and none of my friends do it, but it's not really a huge problem the way that most people think it is. And really what's a bigger problem is that men don't know how to approach women or don't feel like they can comfortably approach women anymore. And they're afraid that anything they say to a woman is going to be treated as assault. And then they'll bring out some cases that I wasn't familiar with of like, this person got accused of sexual assault for brushing past someone in a streetcar or something.
And that's the trouble. There are cases that are, one could say, hey, that's not cool.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I faced this like when I was first getting into social justice stuff, then learning about that is like, there's always that example, or of the person who was bad, or the black person who beat up a white guy because he was white, or, there's always those individual cases.
Mm-hmm.
And it just seems like, again, it seems very cherry picky, and I don't know. I guess you can't dismiss it without actually addressing it, but
yeah, it's hard. I keep coming back around to the same things at this point, right? I spin my wheels on like, be sympathetic. Treat every new person as a new potential, someone who's not, they're not bad people. They're just habituated in problematic ways. They've probably got the wrong kinds of information, and they're probably also facing some real problems. Like, don't discount that people, that real individuals may be suffering from even attempts to implement good ideas in society, right? So
yeah, that's fair. The person who fits into that one case that was, falsely accused and is justifiably upset about that, like, that person did suffer, right? And it is good to have empathy for them as well.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely. Like, I guess I should throw in my caveat right here that explanations aren't excuses, and people who do things that are wrong need to be, that behavior needs to be changed, often via methods that might involve punishment of some sort, right? You have to change that behavior, and you have to deter that behavior from other people. And, you should absolutely understand the situation for the victim, and go out of your way to make sure that individual or survivor has what they need in order to feel safe and comfortable, and to have less individuals experience things like that in the world, right? And I do think that the way we do that effectively, though, is like, this is, you mentioned race earlier, and this is another sort of overlap, right? When liberals especially talk about how to approach things like crime in predominantly black communities, right? There's a shift away from, focusing on the individuals and the bad thing they did, and towards the systemic factors that led towards that kind of behavior, the sense of hopelessness. And what you see is it's the same stuff, right? It's a sense of disempowerment and hopelessness, and a feeling of lack of options that leads to lashing out, often amongst men, right? And so, if we can have that kind of sympathy and understanding for the characters in The Wire, right, we have to learn to have it for the characters in the MRA version of The Wire, too.
Oh, gee. That sounds so awful.
I mean, I probably offended as many people as possible by putting it that way, which I hope gets the point across.
But yeah, no, that's right. What you're saying makes sense. It's just...
Speaking the truth in the most disturbing ways possible.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that like people can't express anger either, right? I should also add that other caveat that attaches to the concern for the empathy of the survivors, right? You also need people to be allowed to get angry. And like, there's a common tool of the patriarchy that especially the anger of non-white men, in all their various forms have been sort of suppressed or treated as not acceptable within the discourse. And that is a problematic tool that I see pulled out time and again. And so I think, if I were talking to the people on the other side, right? If I were talking to the folks, especially the ones who are feeling uncomfortable, but they've not got full anti-feminist or something like that, but they're like, they're sympathetic, right? They're leaning in some kind of way, and they have an interaction with someone who sort of blasts them out of the gate, right? Like, I think, what they need to do, their version of us having sympathy for the MRA version of The Wire, is they need to have sympathy for that individual, recognizing that they most likely have already had this conversation multiple times today, right? That they've already had a bunch of people say a bunch of horrible shit to them already today, or in the recent past, and that this behavior is likely something that they got pushed into, much like that person might currently be feeling like they are being pushed in certain directions as well. So I think, giving generous reads even when people come at you in problematic ways should be the goal of anyone who actually wants to understand the other side of this.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a lot. I know.
I was trying to wrap my head around all that.
Yeah.
I guess part of it almost seems like we all have to be sympathetic to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
like you can't, even when they're not behaving the best ways.
I mean, how did you end up as not one of those kind of men?
Yeah, by patience from people that I dealt with.
Right.
That I talked to.
The luck of patience from people.
That's right.
So.
Yeah. Just interacted with the right people and.
So you got to be the luck you want to see in the world.
Yeah.
It's hard though. I mean, I'm not saying any of this is easy. I'm not saying any of it's going to solve anything forever perfectly, or maybe even in a large amount, or maybe even in our lifetimes. Who knows? Right. I'm just this just seems to me to be the starting point that I like to work from. And then from there, it's a lot of pushing rocks up hills. But sometimes, the other person helps you when you both push the rock up a hill. It's not always got to be, they're not always the rock, right? Yeah, sometimes you're the rock. Sometimes it's good to remember that you are the one that's actually in the way of progress in this particular moment.
Yeah.
So
something that, we'll wrap this portion of the discussion up here right away, but I wanted to say, okay, how do we know the difference between, say, a person that is just asking questions for real and a person that is intentionally being the rock that won't go up the hill?
Right. So how do you distinguish sea lions from not sea lions?
Yeah.
It's hard. And really the only answer, it's like doing a void conf test for a replicant, right? It's a lot of questions. You gotta work on it. There's no, you're not going to figure it out in the first 3 seconds or something like that.
Right.
So it comes down to whether the questions, at some point shift from genuine to leading to mostly rhetorical speeches with a question thrown on the end. Right, that's usually a dead giveaway.
Yeah, that one's a good one.
If someone is really genuinely interested, you can figure it out pretty quickly, right? I do really think so. That I'm joking aside about sea lions. I think it's hard to, especially in person. It's a little harder on maybe Twitter or something, but I do feel like if you're talking to someone in person and you're at least reasonably able to read other human beings, right, you can get a sense of how defensively someone is approaching a question versus how open-mindedly they're approaching it, and the way that they frame the question, the way their body language is, a lot of stuff. Like,
Yeah.
So on Twitter, I mean, I think it's sort of 20 questions, and you know, I like to turn questions. I mean, like, because I'm a Socratic, sea lions don't really bother me because I can ask questions longer than anyone else can. Right? It's
yeah.
You know, eventually they either get bored and try a different tactic, or if they're genuinely interested, then we have an interesting conversation.
Right.
So that's another good note of advice for folks, right? Move away from declarative statements. I'm going to make a declarative statement now. Move away from declarative statements and towards asking questions. All right? Like, really open every conversation just asking about what the other side's coming from, why they think this. Try to find out more about them. Like, don't dive into, and I do it sometimes too, and it's always my worst arguments when I do it are the ones where I forget to do this and just go straight for, like, well, here's what I think, right? Like, find out what the other person thinks. Ask them questions. You know, eventually in asking them questions, not only you'll find out what they think, you'll find if there are points at which you really genuinely disagree and points at which you think that they have the wrong information. And then it might actually be valuable to say something declarative.
Yeah. I guess I come at it a lot from the skeptical community, right? Mm-hmm. Where, like, we're talking about science. So when somebody comes in and they go, oh, well, GMOs do this and they do that, and they're causing babies to grow a second head. And you can go, no, none of that's right. Here's some evidence to show why that's not right. And here's where you're making your mistakes. Mm-hmm. And with social issues, I find that that's not as easy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where, like you say, like, asking questions, finding out where they're at is probably going to be way more effective.
Yeah. And language, like, I've worked a lot in my life at the thanks to my stepmother, who is a trained mediator, taught me a lot to sound less terrible when I talk to people. Like, well, yeah, I mean, like, I probably still sound condescending as fuck to a lot of people. Sorry, I shouldn't be cursing.
Well, that's fine.
No, but, like, I probably still come off as very condescending to a lot of folks, and I apologize profusely to those who I still do. But it is really something where I've worked a lot on, you know, just how you frame a statement, right? In my opinion, this is my impression. It seems to me that kind of stuff versus this is the way it is, like, hits people differently. And that might seem like mealy-mouthed kind of stuff, but I think if you do it in earnest, right, if you don't do it in a patronizing kind of way, but if you really do it with the intent of conveying that while you do hold a belief, you are open to alternatives, but this is how it really does genuinely appear to you, I think that does affect how people hear it. And I think you can at least get slightly better results sometimes. It takes work.
Well, yeah, that sounds, yeah, it takes work, but, you know, it's got to be done.
Keep trying to put yourself in the mind of the other person, right? If not to justify away whatever they believe, but even if as a good communicator, right, you should be trying to see how you are coming across to them. And any communicator who says, you know, if they're not hearing me, that's their problem, is just not doing it very well. Like, and that's why being a communicator is usually going above and beyond what it might feel like people should be expected to do a lot of the time. I think it really is a process of meeting people where they are over and over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't say nothing about that, like, bad about that approach. It's,
as a Canadian, you're hardwired for it, right? I assume I wanted to make a joke earlier in the gym thing about that. Like, you're an entirely baited male culture at this point anyway, right? Like, you and the British people, the reason you don't understand any of these problems is because you've already completely bitten down on that feminist blue pill.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't actually believe that. I'm sure there are many Canadians who can beat me up.
Yeah. But they wouldn't.
That's because they're already, right, they're whipped. Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's right. Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, this is a good place to end this portion.
Great.
Have a good one, man.
I'll catch you later.
I will let you know when this is out.
All right. Thanks very much.
If you like what we're doing and want to help us keep the lights on, go become a patron at patreon.com/brainstorm podcast. You can hear the bonus half hour that we record every episode and get a shout out when you support the show. Become a patron for just $1 an episode at patreon.com/brainstorm podcast. Or you can support the show by ordering a t-shirt, mug or other gear from our store at caffeepress.ca/brainstorm podcast gear. If you can't afford to become a patron or buy gear, then why not give us a rating or write a review on iTunes or Stitcher? Every rating makes it easier for people to find us. Thanks for your support.
Okay, that's all. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Aaron and I talked for an extra half hour or so for patrons only. You can get that by becoming a patron for as little as $1 an episode at patreon.com/brainstormpodcast. For all the things, you can check out the show notes at thebrainstormpodcast.com or our website, brainstormblog.net. Thanks to our financial supporters, Kayla, Kim, Stephanie, Zach, the Utah Outcasts, Aaron, Daryl, Bob Glenn, Destin Doesn't Suck That Much, Magnus, several species of small furry animals gathered together in a cave, Positively Skeptical, Rob, the Podunk Polymath, the Flying Spaghetti Monster Sauce Be Upon Him, Freethinker215, Larry, and Driffa. When we hit 20 patrons, I'll stop reading them all off and just read the skeptic level and above. If you want to join them and help the show grow, then you can do that at patreon.com/brainstormpodcast. Or you can do the one-time donation at paypal.me/brainstormpodcast. Or buy some stuff at tpublic.com/stores/brainstorm-podcast-gear. Thanks to Dave for our intro music. Thanks to Aaron Rabi for doing the intro voiceover. You can find his podcast at voidpod.com. Thanks to Alex Capper Murdoch for doing the voiceover for our ad. And thanks to Jason Camo for our outro music. You can find his stuff at aloststateofmind.com. All music played is either with permission or under the SOCAN license to play. For more information on SOCAN, you can check out the music license info page on our website, brainstormblog.net. If you can't support us with cash, then a great way to help the show is to give us a rating, a thumbs up, or a fave on your podcatcher of choice. Join our Facebook group, like our page, follow us on Twitter, share the show, and spread the word. Thanks for listening, and remember, the truth matters.